Round 8 of the candidates tournament saw the encounter between the two leaders, Levon Aronian and Vishwanathan Anand. Unfortunately, this one burnt out quite quickly. They had a repetition of moves after, well, something like 13 moves. So not much going on there. In the other couple of games, we had Vladimir Kramnik against Dmitry Andreikin. Well, that promised a great deal, but that also fizzled out to a draw after around about 30 moves. And Topalov against Mamedyarov also ended in a draw after, well, quite a sharp game. But after 4 hours, that left just one game remaining, and that was between Sergei Karjakin, playing with black, and Peter Svidler with white. Now, after quite a promising opening, Svidler had kind of messed things up, and Karjakin took control. And, well, we joined the position after Svidler's 47th move, and you can see that Karjakin is a pawn up. Now, it doesn't look like a very good pawn. It's this doubled G-pawn. That's Karjakin's extra pawn. As we'll see, that has some significance in this game. There are opposite coloured bishops, but both rooks are on the board, and, well, that can mean quite a lot actually. So there is plenty of play in this position, and at this point it's clear that Karjakin has taken control. Svidler had played inaccurately, and his rook, so Karjakin's rook breaks through, threatening these two pawns. Svidler played rook f4. Of course, he needs to try to exchange pieces. Okay, now there's a threat to this bishop to take here and, well, try to take as many pawns as possible, actually. So, good move from Karjakin. This bishop comes back to take here. Now, I think a good move was to play king e6. Now, if Svidler wants to take off the c5 pawn, then he's got to exchange here, and that allows black to undouble the pawns, and then he takes here. And I think black is in control. He's straightened out his kingside pawn, so he's ready to push here, and the d pawn is also some threat. Very promising for black. Instead, Karjakin exchanged. Now this is still pretty good. Okay, he checked white's king back, and then he took on d3. Well, you can see, probably better to have that pawn on f5 rather than g5. Anyway, still promising position for black. And here the simplest move is just to play king f5 and come forward. And sometimes you can even just play g4, exchange off the pawns, and go for an attack on the king. But instead, Karjakin played a very tempting move, bishop e8. Now he's trying to get this bishop onto the long diagonal and then advance with the king, and that will be even better. But Svidler appreciated the danger and brought his king round, and if the bishop comes to the long diagonal, that's where it would like to be, then the king comes to e2, and that's rather embarrassing for this rook. So Karjakin came back to h5, hoping that Svidler would repeat, and then he'll push forward with king f5. But instead, Svidler tried to improve things. He played his king to e2. There came a check. King went to d2. And here, well, black could exchange on f3, but this is where you can see that it's an opposite colour bishop's ending that really is a draw. Because here, well, black isn't even a pawn up, but basically white can stop that pawn very easily with the bishop. So instead of that, it's important to hold on to the d pawn. White needs counterplay, rook g2, hitting the pawn. And now here's a big decision from Karjakin. Now they'd been playing at this stage for, well over 5 hours, and calculating these endgames is very difficult indeed. So here, for instance, it's tempting just to take this pawn on f3. Then white would check. And now black can attempt to actually attack white's king with rook e2 check. So the king has to go to the back rank, and suddenly this looks very dangerous indeed. in combination with, well, all the pieces actually, maybe the king can come to the side and try to get a mating net against the king. In fact, after this move, very calm move, it seems as though white is defending. If the king ever nudges to the side, then bishop d4 check is a good move. So looks like white is okay there. So instead of taking the pawn on f3, Karjakin decided to defend the pawn with the king. Good move. That preserves the most winning chances. But he does give up this d pawn. And now again you could take this off, but white captures that g pawn. And, well, of course, black has some chances here. But the problem is that very often white can actually give up this bishop for the pawn, exchange off all the pieces, and then use his king to attack the queenside pawns. We'll see a variation where that is possible later on. Karjakin made an excellent decision here. He brought his rook back, guarding his extra pawn. Now you might not think that's significant, but just hang on. Okay, Svidler needs activity. Rook d7, good move, declining the exchange of rooks. And now Karjakin took that pawn and the rook came to the back rank. And here Karjakin made an excellent decision. His technique at this point was superb. It looks promising to advance the g pawn, but then there's a check. And, well, if the king comes this way, then you keep checking. So king g3 to continue the support of this pawn. And now rook g8. Okay, the king comes to the side to let the pawn advance, but then you take. Now, this is one of those situations I was talking about earlier, where the g pawn can be forced home, you can win the bishop, but you can see that white's king is perfectly placed to trade off all the pawns, and it's going to be a very simple draw indeed. To make it even more difficult for black, remember that it's the wrong colour rook's pawn, but okay, white is drawing very comfortably. But Karjakin came up with a brilliant move. He played bishop e4. Now, there are a couple of good reasons behind this move. One is that you can shield your king from checks with the bishop, so you can play the bishop to f5. The other is that you can actually hold the pawn with g6. So, okay, this is the game continuation. Now, it's very difficult for white to find any kind of constructive defence here. Svidler came up with what looked like an excellent try. He played rook g8, so there's Karjakin's idea. So he holds his extra pawn, and that means, well, that when this one goes home, even if you can win the bishop, then you get another g pawn following behind it. But Svidler tried rook g7. Now, at first, this looked like an excellent defence. If black trades, then it looks as though white has very good drawing chances here. It's not completely clear, but probably pretty comfortable. In fact, this pawn can be stopped. The bishop can always sit back here, and it's possible to stop black's king coming over to take these pawns. I mean, sometimes you can just give one of them up, but often the white king can just come back. That should be a draw with care. So what did he do? Well, he played a brilliant move. Rook takes. Now, maybe this is fairly obvious. The move that many of us were calculating here was playing the pawn to g4. But we couldn't see a way through this. Now, this is still, white is on the edge here, but it looks as though he can probably hold. His king is in a very good position. So, for example, when black's king comes over to try to win this rook, then white is probably just in time. I mean, one thing is, for example, that if black makes a queen, then you can divert the bishop, and now the king comes across, and white is in time to take that pawn. Now there are other tries for black. It is very close, but the position of the king here is crucial and gives white, well, let's say good drawing chances. But Karjakin had prepared something else. He found this move. I mean, this is so beautiful. You sacrifice the exchange and then follow up with a quiet move, b6. This is wonderful. Now, if the rook comes across to take this pawn, then it simply can't get back in time. You can see what a good job this pawn does, and the bishop, of shielding the king and the pawn, and this one's just going to go through. Svidler found the only chance to bring his king back. And, well, one thing is that if this pawn advances carelessly, then the king can run the other way, and this one isn't so clear, to try to stop the pawn. Karjakin found another excellent move. Instead of pushing the pawn, king here. Now, if there's a check, then once again the bishop shields. Really the only thing that white can do is grab this pawn. Now the coast is clear for the g-pawn to advance. Svidler took a pawn. The g-pawn goes forward. Now the rook has to come back to stop this pawn. But you can see the difference between this position and the other variation we just looked at. Black's king is far better placed. It blocks out white's king over here. And instead of going in straight away, Karjakin advanced his g-pawn. Now there's nothing that white can do except advance his queenside pawns. He can't improve the position of his rook, so he pushes. And now the king came in. There are other ways to win this, by the way. Now you can't stop the g-pawn queening, but the way that Karjakin found was really beautiful. So he queens, and now it's turning into a race. But Sergei had it all worked out. So they exchanged. And the g-pawn advanced. Here we go. It's a race to the finishing line. Now if b6, then the bishop can stop both pawns. So c6, g-pawn advanced again, and b6, king f2, b7, you have to go this way, and black gets a queen. White gets a queen. But watch what happens now. Queen check. Incredibly, this is a forced win for black. If the king goes to the b-file, then you win white's queen. That. So Svidler played king d4. Of course, both players had seen what was going to happen now. Now, if king d5, bishop e6 wins, and you win the queen with this skewer. And sometimes having a c-pawn can be a draw if the pawn is on the 7th rank. So if it were white to play here, you could play c7, it would be a draw. But queen b5 is a winning move, pinning, and if king d6, now c7 isn't really a threat because you play here, and the queen stops the pawn. In the game, Svidler played king c4, but this was just as bad or as good, and here he resigned. If the king has to go to the b-file, and then queen b3 wins the queen on b8. Just brilliant technique from Karjakin. Very impressive indeed. Remember, that calculation took place, well, it was around about after 6 hours of play. Very difficult indeed. So, after 8 rounds, we have Anand and Aronian out in front with 5 points, Kramnik 4.5, and then 5 players, Svidler, Topalov, Andreikin, Mamedyarov and Karjakin, all on 3.5. So that means with 6 rounds still to play, any of the 8 players could still win the tournament.